Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 module 4 West Coast Feminism, Suzanne Lacy and the Guerrilla Girls. This week we're going to continue on with our discussion of first generation feminism, which as we've identified has some pretty general goals that remain fairly constant throughout this movement that really starts in the 60s and works its way all through the 70s. Even into the 80s, although during the 80s it's going to be more and more contested by other forms of feminism that had a substantial problem with the idea of the essential nature of women's identity that was often espoused either directly or indirectly by the early feminist artists that we've been covering. Just to recap here, some of the key features of early or first generation feminist arts in the United States are that they were seeking the feminine sensibility or female identity by revaluing and redefining some of the traditional characteristics that had been ascribed to women throughout the ages. Now, sometimes this simply meant kind of revaluing those forms, but other times it means completely redefining them, such as, let's say, Carolee Schneeman's work on female sexuality on its own terms. Another key feature of these early feminists that we've seen so far is that in seeking a feminine sensibility or some kind of essential characteristics of woman, they would oftentimes look to cultures or precedents that predated patrilineal or patriarchal societies. The belief here, and it's a fairly consistent one among various groups that we'll be covering this quarter, is that it's intensely important to build a constituency first off, to draw attention to the similarities or correspondences between large groups of people, which for first generation feminists meant trying to figure out what was essentially or characteristically woman. This draws together everyone of that gender, or at least has the possibility of doing that. And by building that constituency, together you can exert a large degree of agency for change in the world around you. Now, just like a number of these movements that we'll cover, we tend to see the identity politics of various groups, whether it be around gender or race and ethnicity or even sexuality, starting out by trying to build this constituency based upon common characteristics or even essential qualities that could be ascribed to the various members of the group. But then as these movements go along, they start to see that this tends to pigeonhole them, and we will follow this story. In other words, for instance, we see this first group of feminists seeking out in earlier cultures such as matrilineal Crete or prehistoric cultures that espoused goddess worship and really revered the feminine body as a kind of microcosm of the larger workings of nature. That's seeking out these moments before patriarchy had defined women on its own terms, seeking out a point at which the woman's body and woman had not been appropriated by patriarchal culture. We find this, for instance, again, when we'll look at the issue of race or ethnicity and black arts, where you might think back to what you know about the rise of various movements among African-American black artists, starting with, let's say the Harlem Renaissance or the civil rights movement of the 1950s. And what you see over and again is a seeking out of kind of the origins of this culture and, for instance, African culture and African designs and African songs. Emblematic of this is the kente cloth and so forth. Or if you move to gay and lesbian and, by extension, GLBTQ arts, what we see very commonly is seeking out a biological reason for homosexuality or non-normative, sexualities so as to justify them. But then that gives way to the question of why do we need to justify them in terms of nature? Maybe there's other ways to be thinking about these things. So, with that being said then, some of the key strategies that we've seen in the early feminist movement or characteristics that are ascribed to women, are things like collaboration is key, the belief that women work together better This is based upon ideas of nurturance and ideas of lack of ego. Sometimes early feminists will have a problem with that and say we need to be less collaborative and really, strike out on our own terms, just like those, genius males. But that tends to be less frequent than the emphasis on collaboration. Another one is inversion. By inverting cultural norms, we can see the way that various cultural norms have become naturalized, seemingly true, only to discover that there's some kind of asymmetry when, for instance, a male is represented as a nude and passive and so forth in all the ways that the female has been represented. We realize that just doesn't seem right, it doesn't look right, and that leads us to think, why doesn't it look right? What's in the way of this? What are our cultural presumptions that don't allow us to see this inversion in the same way that we saw the original image that's out there? Another one that I've just gone over is seeking out in cultures that predate patriarchal, patrilineal society some alternative. This addresses ideas around the great goddess, which came up a lot last week and will continue to come up a little bit today, some kind of essential feminine that is inherent in nature that is sought out by feminist artists, right? Those are some of the big ones here. And of course, some of the big themes are sexuality, right? So with Carolee Schneemann trying to assert the idea of a sexualized subject, someone who's not just an object or a projection of the desire of others, but someone who has their own desires and needs and wants and so forth, like we would ascribe to any individual. That's what Carolee Schneemann's up to, and frankly, it seems to me that's what John Berger was trying to draw our attention to when he was talking about the difference between the naked and the nude. The naked is seeing someone for themselves, kind of like walking in on someone who's in a shower and taking account of the impact of your own presence in relation to them, your own desires in relation to their desires, having to account for them, resisting your, fantastical projections onto them and so forth. The other one was spirituality. We saw a lot of this, like many people even today, and I certainly don't mean to step on the toes of those who are of the Judeo-Christian faith here. It's not what I'm up to, but there have been a lot of criticisms out there that these big institutions tend to codify some of the big, authoritative beliefs that are inherent in Western culture. And then, of course, because they're so powerful, they are a mechanism of coercion and control, again, according to a lot of people, making women fit into the roles that they are ascribed within the religious cultures or the religious systems that we are dealing with. So, Mary Beth Edelson in particular has a real difficulty with Christian culture and Christian belief systems because she believes that they actually interpolate women as submissive and lesser than, and even when they are extolling the virtues of the essential feminism within Christianity as something that is inherently good, like the Virgin Mary, it's a real double bind, right? She is the best of all women, but she has a status that most women, as far as I know, cannot attain, right? She's the perfect mother, but she's also a virgin. Try to pull that one off. In any case, so then on with the lecture for this week. We'll start off with a little coverage of Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro and the development of the Feminist Art Program, move to Judy Chicago's famous, emblematic work, The Dinner Party, which you see here in front of you. Then move on to Woman House, which was one of the big installations and exhibition venues of the Feminist Art Program at Cal Arts in California. And then move on to some activist feminist artists. First, Suzanne Lacy's work, and then the Guerrilla Girls. So what you see in front of you on the screen is a picture of Judy Chicago on the left and Miriam Shapiro on the right. They are famous. They're not West Coast artists per se. They were working all over the United States. At this point, Miriam Shapiro was a pretty successful artist as a hard-edge painter, having gallery representation in New York. Judy Chicago, to a lesser extent. But they're famous for starting the first feminist art program, first at Cal State Fresno in 1969, where what they wanted to do, and this was not uncommon in the late 60s, early 70s among various artist groups, whether they be in literature and poetry or what have you, they wanted to create a completely free of men, woman's space for the production of art. Now this tends to, I think in a knee-jerk kind of way, irritate a lot of people because it smacks of that kind of radical feminism that many people ascribe to women, the values of being men haters or men are all the bad guys here. And I don't think that's really what this was all about, at least in the way that the participants of this program talked about it. The basic idea was something that we can see is very familiar from the John Berger reading. When John Berger is talking about surveillance, the way that women constantly survey himself, he's really speaking about the female nude. So he's talking about the man in the woman's mind through which she sees herself and fashions herself accordingly. Now we might extend that, and we'll see this being extended later on when we get to second generation feminism through post-structuralist theories about how subjectivities are formed, to say that at all moments we all perceive ourselves through the presumed eyes of others, and that women, having been set up, as Simone de Beauvoir once said, as the second sex, tend to see themselves through the patriarchal eyes in their head and conform whether they want to, or struggle against this, or constantly judge themselves in relation to the values that they have inherited from society. I hope this makes sense to everyone. So the idea of a male-free zone was one in which women could start to distance themselves from that surveying eye of man or patriarchy that is always kind of hovering in our consciousness. Put themselves in a place where they didn't have to feel judged by men or judged by masculine values, and start to explore what feminine sensibility might be. In these programs, first starts in Fresno, and then within a year it moves up to Cal Arts in LA for a couple of years, about 3 years, and then becomes eventually what was known as the Women's Building, also administered by Judy Chicago at this point in the mid-70s. Common to these programs is a form of generating content or generating subject matter that was known as consciousness raising. Basically, women would sit in a circle so as to emphasize the idea of collaboration. There's no head at this circle, only mentors helping each other out, and talk about the issues that they confronted or the ideas in their head as they came forth in a very messy way, and then start to, expand upon those ideas or analyze those ideas and explore those ideas, suggesting to each other, extensions of what they have brought up. And also, thinking about how these might take visual form in various arts. This is a very important practice of the West Coast Feminists and the Feminist Art Program, consciousness raising, to generate content, to talk about issues, to talk about one's own feeling in relation to the society in which one lived. You often heard during the 1960s into the 70s the slogan among the second wave of feminists, so the larger societal movement of feminism, the personal is political. And this came up in a number of your discussions this week. What is meant by that is that things that are going on in the individual heads of individual women, maybe isolated from one another in their own homes, needed to be brought forth, needed to be articulated, made public. And in making these public, such as in these consciousness-raising sessions, these individual issues and problems and concerns and, vulnerabilities, frankly, one could see that they were shared by other people, building a constituency. And then, since these are now made public, these issues could be taken in the realm of politics, change, changing of the power structure and so forth. Before we get into some of the things that came out of the Feminist Art Program at Cal Arts, let's look at Judy Chicago's emblematic work, The Dinner Party, which you've had a pretty substantial reading on by Lucy Lepard. There's also an optional reading that I've provided by Amelia Jones, which is a really excellent overview of all the criticisms and problems and, frankly, strengths of this work. What Amelia Jones, in her optional reading, is trying to deal with is a common way that early feminism was framed by criticism later in the 1980s when second generation came around. And one of the ways that it was framed was biologically essential. You know, we've been covering this a little bit. Biological essentialism was something that was really frowned upon during that time period, and so a whole host of early feminist activities were dismissed on the grounds that they were too essentialist, right? Too biologically determinative. If, for instance, you wanted to be a woman who was not nurturing, was not a mom, was not just about the body, early feminism, so the later feminists said, kind of locked you in that box and naturalized it, made it seem as if the essential characteristics of women were only this one set of characteristics and could not be other than that. In other words, women couldn't transgress that bipolar field of representation and start to perform activities and exhibit characteristics that had traditionally been ascribed to men because they had claimed, this is the criticism, early feminism had claimed that there were certain things that were essential to women. So if you want to get into the questions of how that plays out, this is a Amelia Jones optional reading. It's a pretty good source for that. So then back to this work. First of all, what you're looking at, although the brainchild of Judy Chicago is really the result of many, many collaborators producing this work. It's her idea. She was the head of what was once called the benevolent hierarchy of this production. But the work itself was oftentimes made by other artists. There were over 200, both men and women, all across the United States and into Canada, who helped contribute to this work of art. Its basic idea has to do with another feminist, big idea of the time, that women's history had been erased, had been eradicated, that there were women in history who had contributed to culture in very important ways, but the patriarchal culture and modern culture in particular hadn't really documented this, hadn't taken the time to show the world or make visible the contributions of women throughout history. In early feminism, the somewhat kind of silly title for this is, instead of his story, her story, right? The history told from the standpoint or according to the main actors who were women during these time periods, so her story. So there's a big component of this because the dinner party, which is a massive work, it's, you can't tell it here, but it's 39 plus feet per side, huge monumental work, has place settings, 13 to a side, that represent, starting in prehistory, major contributors to women's her story. All these big names, starting with the primordial kind of great goddess imagery all the way around the table to early modern times. The last plate on the table is dedicated to Georgia O'Keeffe. So that's one component of it. In or on the tiles in the middle of the dinner party, written in cursive writing, so very kind of personal, and in gold lettering, are the names of 999 other women who have contributed to history but who have not really been acknowledged or even outright erased, so the argument goes, by patriarchal values. So then, some more of the imagery here. It's very symbolically based. The triangle that you see here, that inverted triangle, was a symbol of power in ancient times of women. It's the pudentic triangle, right? So this type of imagery shows up over and again in this work. You'll see it on the plates as well. The plates oftentimes reference female genitalia. These became known as central core imagery or vulvic or vulvar imagery, lots of V's in there. which were meant to represent the central core of women, something that all women had in common, something that was kind of the center of their being, something that made them different. And just like we saw in Carolee Schneeman's work, something that hadn't been appropriated or was outright kind of repellent to patriarchal culture that could be revalued and situated within a woman's experience of her body and her existence. Now, this is something that, again, drove a lot of people crazy, to reduce the woman's body or woman to her genitalia. But I think you have to think of this symbolically as well. It's not just about we are vaginas or something of that sort. We are vulvas. It's about what makes us different. This is this thing that is central to women's experience. It's something that corresponds with nature in some pretty important ways. It's something that has been valued, but maybe not completely by patriarchal culture. We need to revalue it. We need to, think our way through what makes us as women different, and this is one of the key kind of biological features that makes us different. The plates themselves, as they run around the table, we'll see this, keep changing the relief of the plates. In other words, when they start off, the plates are porcelain that have been painted or glazed, but they're quite flat. And then as you move around the table towards modern times, if you look at this image in front of us, you can see that the juxtaposition of the plate on the right is very flat. The one on the left has a high level of relief. They keep gaining greater relief as you go around the table, which was meant to say that in the early days, let's say, in primordial culture, women were really bound to their traditional roles, but they keep kind of getting closer and closer to breaking out of their setting, breaking out of these traditional roles. And the one, as I said, devoted to George O'Keeffe is the highest in relief and meant to symbolize that. In addition, you'll see that once again, we have a table that does not have a head to the table. It is, it's not round in this case, but it doesn't have a leadership role. It's meant to reference collaboration. Along with that symbolism, we have one more major symbol that I want to point out, and that's that on each side of the table there are 13 place settings. 13 in Western culture is an unlucky number, but that happens to be, again, one of those numbers that originally was a quite lucky or powerful number associated with Wiccan culture. It's the number in some Wiccan societies of the witch's coven, which is a number of power, a collaborative group of women that when they reach the threshold of 13 gain even more power. And you can see, or you can surmise, that this was probably negatively framed, just as the serpent was by Judeo-Christian theology here. The main thing, though, about this work is that, of course, it was collaborative in its production. Many, many people took part in creating this work of art, and in the process of creating this work of art, shared their thoughts about, feminist issues, shared their ideas and their knowledge about some of the names that they were, as you see here, writing on the tiles that are in the middle of this work. The work itself is also essential. In other words, the medium. This was a very important component of early feminist art production. You see here that they're doing things that are traditionally understood as crafts. So ceramic work, the creation of porcelain and ceramics, needlepoint in the runners, embroidery, and so forth. These are all traditionally understood as crafts. And as crafts, at least in modern times, their value was much less than that of arts. But traditionally, crafts such as these were things performed by women. So once again, we see a revaluing of a cultural form that traditionally was ascribed to women, but undervalued, let's say from the Renaissance forward, by Western culture, that is now embraced or reappropriated by women and redefined in their actions. So we oftentimes call this in early feminism woman's work, meaning, in this case, traditional art making that was performed by women that is now embraced as part of the feminine experience and used as the major purveyor of feminist ideas here. So if you see these plates coming around, you see the higher relief and that central core imagery again. Everything on this table is handmade. One of the things that, I can't quite relay to you just in these kind of crummy little visual imagery is how monumental this work is. It's now in the Brooklyn Museum in its own room, and it's overpowering, and it's just filled with so much work, so much kind of careful attention to the quality of making, along with all the symbolism. You see it here from the side. We're kind of on the last table side here. Some of the names that are included in the main place settings, big names for us today, I think. Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Blackwell, Emily Dickinson. This is a close-up of the plate devoted to the snake goddess. So remember those snake goddesses from Minoan Crete. And all of the, these are like conversation pieces in a way. If you're around these works and you have some knowledge, you can share it with other people about what the snake goddess probably was, how women were exalted in these early matrilineal societies and how they're not now. And, really, this work develops those dialogues above and beyond its own symbolic nature. This is the work devoted to Artemisia Gentileschi. We'll come back to her with the Guerrilla Girls briefly. She was a Baroque artist. Natalie Barney, of course, early century literary figure, and Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the most extolled artists of the early 20th century, and an artist that many early feminists deeply admired and used as an emblem of their own aspirations, much, as I said, to the chagrin of Georgia O'Keeffe, who didn't really want to be associated with women or women's art, but rather just the great artists. And we see here that vulvic imagery, that central core imagery, that has now gained a great deal of relief. She still, as Judy Chicago said, is stuck in her place setting, but the next generation of feminists might move beyond this. So at the Feminist Art Program, as I've said, in Cal State Fresno, consciousness raising was a huge activity to generate art, generate discussions around these big ideas. When this program moved up to Cal Arts in LA, an opportunity presented itself that resulted in the month-long exhibition of women's installation work primarily and performances known as Woman House. There was a large mansion slated for demolition because of a couple of connections that artists associated with the Feminist Art Program had. They were able to get the city to allow them to refurbish this house and fill it with art and performances over the course of a month and open this to the public. And this became, again, a huge emblem of early West Coast feminist art. I can't go into all the ins and outs of everything that happened in Woman House. You have a nice long reading that will get to some of the activities that I'm not going to cover here today, but I want to cover some of the big ones, starting with the basic idea of learning by doing, right? Learning by doing. How do we think of that, about this? Well, the first part of this is they came to this house and it was dilapidated, right? It wasn't used. It needed to be fixed up just to turn it into a space that could be used for exhibitions. Now, many of these women hadn't ever done that kind of labor before that was traditionally ascribed to men's activities, right? Building, replacing plumbing, unclogging drains maybe, or frankly, painting and patching and electrical work. They all had to learn this in the process, and in so doing, empower themselves by gaining a skill set that they perhaps didn't have before. In addition to that, though, the space as they were building it became a space in which they could share ideas, have these impromptu consciousness-raising sessions on the way to generating the art that would then fill the space. One of the first installations that I want to show you in the entire space is a huge building, 16 plus rooms or so, was filled with installations done either by one of the members of the Feminist Art Program, I think there were 22 or so that contributed to this, or in collaboration with one another. What you're looking at here is a work that's called the matrimonial staircase. The matrimonial staircase was meant to be a something that would catalyze a discussion over the institution of marriage and anything that women might want to talk about in relation to this institution. Some of you will know where this is going, of course, but I want to kind of lead us into it slowly. Marriage was one of those very contested realms in early feminism. It was, an institution with a lot of very traditional trappings that one can look at fairly skeptical. But along with that, of course, marriage was something that a lot of women had grown up their entire life visualizing, imagining, seeing as kind of a fulfillment of everything that had led up to this moment. This was kind of the big day. And so, on the one hand, you might very rationally say there are a whole host of trappings that are associated with marriage that I disagree with. But there's this kind of ambivalence there as well, because so much of your life has been, and again, I'm just speaking in kind of traditional ways. Not every woman did this, of course, but it was very common for women to dress up in their mother's clothing or dress up and pretend that they're getting married and imagine what they were going to look like and what the cake was going to look like and all of these things, and to, in one fell swoop, realize that some of the trappings of marriage were things that you didn't agree with, but still have in your heart this real kind of romance of this moment. This work was meant to allow women to kind of talk their way through some of that ambivalence. So just think about this for a minute. When I'm in front of a class face-to-face and talking about this, I oftentimes ask the question, how many women out there have imagined what their wedding is going to look like? And pretty much, most of the women raise their hands. But then when I ask, okay, how many of the men out there have really visualized what their wedding is going to look like? Still, even today, there are very few hands that go up and a lot of kind of bemused look on the face of the men out there. So some of these things haven't changed. What were some of the things that women of this period really found problematic about the institution of marriage? Well, one of them is that a woman has to wear all white, right? White was a symbol of purity, which presumed that a woman was supposed to show up on her wedding night a virgin, which was another mechanism of sexual control of women, or at least it could be thought of that way. In this work, the train of the dress actually spills down the stairway, as you can see over there on the right, and as it turns into the kitchen, it keeps getting grayer and dingier. Again, we're not going to look at the kitchen part, but the kitchen is kind of repetitive actions of one thing after another, just repeatedly making food for the man and so forth, that dims the sheen of the original white. Another thing that early feminists pointed out as problematic about the institution of marriage was that you were given from one man to another as if you were an owned object. Right, so the father gives away the bride to the groom, just kind of a handling of the woman from the father to the groom here. And you can keep going on with this, right? There are many other components of the traditional way that marriage was practiced that were problematic for women. Another close-up of this to show you this. It's one of the few mannequins in the entire work. The flowers that are here, another symbol that women's main value is as a procreator. In taking the wedding vow originally, it was man and wife, of course, was the verbiage that was often employed, which implies an asymmetrical relationship between man and woman. You basically are entering into the domestic role of women when taking this, at least in traditional ways, and the way that this was represented in, let's say, popular culture in such shows as Leave It to Beaver and so forth. If we move into another room, just beyond the kitchen and kind of there's a lead into the kitchen that you can see in some of the readings and the website that are provided to you, into this main area of the kitchen. This is a work by Kathy Huberlin called Eggs to Breaths. All through this kitchen space, which is painted a kind of fleshy tone of pink, I'm sorry, here it turns up white, this artist had filled the space with really, really organized, implements of the kitchen, food, and of course cooking implements, but also most notably these kind of egg/breast forms, which were all these kind of rubber forms that were on the wall, filling up the space. Now, what does this make you think of? What Kathy Huberlin was saying is that, women are procreators. Women, of course, produce the egg that is fundamental to the creation of life. And then, because they have breasts, they can feed that child, which then, in a way, biologically is assumed to predetermine women's role in the domestic sphere as the nurturer, not just of the child, but of the husband as well, and to have some kind of thinking about what all that means. So this is where we get to the big question, one of the things that I asked you about in the reading, which is, in your reading guide, that is, when we were talking about, in the reading guide, Woman House, I said, think about how the home here is a really important kind of integral component of this work. What does it mean to have all of these works cited in a home, in the domestic sphere? How does that play out in this work? But even more importantly, think of the various ways the installations such as this and conversations and performances that we'll see coming up explored the relation between biology and gendered social roles, right? What was that to mean? This is where essentialism gets really muddy in first-generation feminism. They understood that some aspects of biology had been used as evidence for the social roles that women played, that kept them as a kind of second sex, while at the same time they're trying to espouse feminine sensibilities or feminine essential qualities that are somehow related to biology. One of the most famous and interesting encapsulations of this problematic, for me, is a statement made by a really incredibly bright feminist thinker, Judith Butler, who once said, quote, "Within feminist debate, an increasing problem has been to reconcile the apparent need to formulate a politics which assumes the category of woman, right? You need that constituency of woman, with the demand, often politically articulated, to problematize the category, interrogate its incoherence, its internal dissonance, and its constitutive exclusions." So on the one hand, in early feminism, we have this real kind of tension between needing to constitute woman as an essential set of characteristics, as a female sensibility, as shared experience, while on the same hand, or on the other hand, I don't know, trying to criticize or interrogate the ways that this has been a problem historically, trying to collapse the idea of woman so as to open it up to new possibilities. This is one of the installations, a kind of counterpoint to the matrimonial staircase here, which is Sandy Orgel's linen closet. It's a little bit of a one-liner in a sense. It's a literal linen closet where women, of course, women were traditionally considered to be in charge of domestic duties. She's here between these really pristine, beautifully clean sheets, but kind of sequestered in this domestic space, literally, trapped behind the bars of these shelves that hold her in place. And the oft-quoted kind of one-liner here is that the best place for a woman is in the closet or between the sheets. Judy Chicago's contribution to Woman House, and a number of the bathrooms were decorated, which you can read about, was this work called Menstruation Bathroom. One of the things that doesn't often get talked about here is that everyone kind of hones in on the wastebasket full of used feminine hygiene products here, neglecting to see that on the shelves and in the space, everything else is pristine and beautiful and sanitary, very, very sanitary, and everything in its place and wrapped up and protected and so forth. The counterpoint of the overflowing wastebasket is once again to draw our attention to the bodily processes of women, and to ask the question of why we feel repelled by these things, why they are so distressful, both to men and to women. And it's still a bit of a kind of cocktail party joke to just start talking about menstruation in polite company and see how faces pale. We're still concerned about these things today, and I'm not saying we should or shouldn't be. I'm just asking everyone to think, as Judy Chicago was, about why we are so adverse to bodily processes of women, and to think, in addition, as these women would, how these processes in other cultures, certainly non-patriarchal cultures, are oftentimes seen as quite powerful or very relevant to the natural processes of nature and cycles of nature and birth and rebirth and so forth. After all, if we're trying to revitalize the idea of women or revalue it in various ways, to feel ashamed about the processes of their own body, which a lot of women do, of course, is a big problem, obviously. Faith Wilding, again, if you ever get a chance to see her work, which is in a number of venues, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art has a number of these works. It's really quite beautiful crochet work. This is her crocheted environment for the space. She had followed Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro up from Fresno originally. She was one of the main kind of movers in this group of artists. She is again using women's work, so crochet or knitting, to produce her fiber arts here, which would have traditionally been understood as a craft. But of course, these feminists are trying to elevate these crafts to high arts, and why shouldn't they be? They're certainly as, I think, visually exciting as much painting is. In addition to that, you'll see these circular shapes that show up in a lot of early feminist works of art. This is, again, an allusion to central core imagery, or the womb. The web shape itself is related to figures such as Arachne and also women's menstruation huts in Africa, symbolic of the power of women's bodies in relation to the natural world, and so forth. Faith Wilding was also a major part of the performances in Women House, and I'm not going to show you a lot of these. There's a clip of this that you can view. I've given you the link to that on the page for these lectures. This is called Waiting, and I'll just let you see it if you want to see it. She sits in one place, kind of rocking slowly back and forth, looking quite melancholy and certainly alienated from the world around her, talking about all the things that women in their lives wait for, waiting for someone to take care of you, waiting for a husband, waiting for, your first period, waiting for this, all of which are markers of a woman's kind of time on earth, but none of which are particularly valued, and are all, of course, just waiting, never kind of living in that moment. Miriam Shapiro, who is the other main professor in the Feminist Art Program's work, evolved from hard edge painting into these extraordinarily gorgeous quilt forms. What you're looking at here on the screen is Wonderland from 1983. There was a quilt quite like this in Woman House, which I don't have a photograph of. But first, we just start with this. Quilting traditionally is something that, of course, is associated with women. Women sitting around together, doing their quilting bees, sharing patterns, sharing fabrics, and sharing ideas with one another. Traditionally, this type of women's work was sequestered to the realm of craft and not thought of as high art. Part of this is because of modernist ideas about what high art actually is, such as Clement Greenberg's idea that all the different media had to be, working within their media, and you couldn't have things that crossed media boundaries or were utilitarian. You call these things kitsch, and really emphasize that division. Miriam Shapiro was trying to break that division, right? To do what she called femages, homages to women's work throughout the ages. And we see here right in the middle, an emphasis on the home, or a kind of nod to the domestic sphere of these women's activities. Another one of these, her collaboration series with Mary Cassatt, in this case, hand-painted or dyed panels of Mary Cassatt's own work included in these beautiful quilts. So I'd like to move on to something else here now. Moving a little bit beyond the first generation of feminist artists, and they're interested in revaluing and redefining characteristics that are essential to women's sensibility or women's character, women's kind of essential nature, two artists who were dealing with, in a very activist way, some of the ways that, because women had been represented historically, have been thought of in their own societies, were more likely to be prejudiced for on particular qualities. I'm going to pause here and come back to this in lecture number 2.